right, 1 Samuel 20 is where we are this evening. 1 Samuel 20. It's a narrative. There's not a lot of really even application we can make from it. I was working on that this morning and thought there's not just a whole lot of application, but it is history. It does need to be told because we need to fill in the blanks when we look at the history of Israel, when we look at the history of God's people. It's helpful to know the story, and there are things that we'll pull in a little bit. You know, I love sports, but one of the sports that I really love is baseball. And in baseball, if you are a fan, you know that there are signals. You know, the coach sitting in the dugout will give a signal maybe to the third base coach, or depending on if the team is on defense, he'll give a signal maybe to the catcher of the pitch that he wants, or the play that he wants to run, the alignment of the infield. And there are signals given by the third base coach to the player, to the batter, and yet then he might take it all off, or he might put it on. And then there's a signal that a lot of times when they give a signal, then you've got to give a signal back. And it's fun to watch, and it's fun to try to figure out. Well, there are signals in this chapter that are interesting, and we'll talk about them as we see these signs that are given. One of the things that I was reminded of as I was studying this again is that David lies a lot, and seemingly it doesn't bother him. Now, for a lot of people, that causes problems. Why could a man that is said to be after God's own heart, how could he lie and be all right with God? God didn't justify him in his lies. We'll see some of those through, especially from the time beginning. We'll see the first couple of them tonight, probably. And as we look at them, we'll make mention of them. But just remember that there are folks that do things in the Bible that God doesn't commend. God's not saying, oh man, this is all right. But it authenticates in many ways the story that is told. I mean, most of us, if we were telling the story, we'd want to clean it up a little bit. We'd want to polish on it a little bit, make it look good. If you tell the story of your family might have to have their family reunion in jail, but you'll figure out a way to polish that story up, right? He was detained, you might say, instead of he's in prison. There's all kinds of ways of polishing that story up, and you would do it. But that's what makes the Bible so wonderful. It doesn't sugarcoat it. David is not right in his lies, but he does lie, and we'll see that. And we'll see, as we said, we'll talk about the signs, if you will, in just a few minutes when we get there. But let's begin in 1 Samuel 20. Then David fled from Naioth. Some call it Naioth, but Naioth in Ramah, and went and said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father, that he seeks my life? It's kind of interesting because if you recall last week in the 19th chapter, this is kind of the same question that Jonathan asked his father, Saul. But now David asked it of Jonathan. Now remember, one of the things that's interesting, and we'll not develop it tonight, I'm kind of thinking we may kind of try to develop it next week or so, but is the friendship, the close relationship that David and Jonathan have with each other. And as we see it tonight, it's kind of interesting because Jonathan goes in many ways against his father, Saul, for his friend, David. David and Jonathan are together, though. And this question, what have I done? What's my iniquity? What's my sin before your father? Why is he trying to kill me? So Jonathan said to him, by no means, you shall not die. Indeed, my father will do nothing, either great or small, without first telling me. And why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. There's reassurance. If there's a question with regards to David, there's the reassurance of Jonathan Dad's not going to do anything to you. There is an interesting thought here, at least for me, and that is Dad's not going to do anything without telling me. You wonder what kind of relationship they really had. There were a lot of things that my father did in business world and being an elder in the church, things that went on in the church, he never told us about. There are things that I wrote an article back, this has been quite a few years ago. I had an old dog, Suzanne and Ethan and I had had a dog since he was little. And the dog he got old. And one evening, it was very unusual. I'd go let him out of the pen. He'd run around the neighborhood for a few minutes. He'd come back home. And he didn't run out of the pen. He came up and he stayed right at my heels. I knew something was wrong. Sure enough, in a couple of hours, he was dead. But I stayed with him until he passed away. After he passed away, I wrote an article about his death. And I told the members there, I said, he took a lot of your secrets with him, because I said he and I are the only two that knew them, and he took them with him when he passed away. Well, it just leads me to wonder what kind of relationship Jonathan and Saul had, or Jonathan thought they had. That now Dad will tell me. But nevertheless, David took an oath again and said, your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes. And he said, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there's but a step between me and death. In other words, he says, he knows about our relationship. Now, one does not know because the scriptures don't tell us. But one wonders how in the world Saul knew about David and Jonathan. I don't know. But David felt like, at least, that he did, that he knew that there was a great kinship, a great relationship there. And so he says, your father knows, and he doesn't want you to be upset, and so he's not going to tell you. But then he makes a statement. He says, there's a step between me and death. It's a great text to use if you have to preach a funeral sometime. The thought there, we don't really know exactly what David is saying. Does it mean that if he steps out that Saul will kill him? Does it mean that if he steps from the standpoint of in the wrong direction, he's going to die? Don't know. But you can take that thought, there's a step between me and death, and develop it. It is true. There's just a step between us dying and living. Jonathan said to David, whatever you yourselves desire, I'll do it for you. David said to Jonathan, indeed, tomorrow is the new moon. And the new moon was a festival. Go back to the book of Numbers, the 20th chapter, beginning in verse 10 especially. You can also go to Numbers 10:10, but I like the passage in Numbers 28. I think I said 20, 28, where the law, Moses talks about the different feasts and so forth. There were a multitude of sacrifices that were to be made at this new moon feast. And so he says, it's the new moon feast, and I should not fail to sit with the king to eat. But let me go, that I may hide in the field until the third day at evening. So he says, I'm supposed to be with the king. There's some implication here, and it's only implication, but there's some implication that the new moon, the feast, had kind of gotten into not only a sacrifice, but a little bit of a party situation. It could be that David, and some have speculated that what it is David had become more of an inner circle with Saul than maybe we even realize. And so for that reason, he was supposed to sit with the king, and he's making excuses as far as not being there. He tells Jonathan, he says, let me go, let me hide in the field until the third day at evening. Probably the third day here is the third day from today. Some have said, and maybe correctly so, but some have said, let me hide in the field to the third day of the feast. But it would seem as if he's saying the third day from today. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city, for there's a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. Now David would have understood that. Not sure Saul would have, probably so, but nevertheless, this is his excuse. If he says thus, it is well, your servant will be safe. But if he is very angry, be sure that evil is determined by him. Therefore, you shall deal kindly with your servant. The idea of dealing kindly is the idea of you'll be faithful. So this little agreement, you could call it a covenant agreement, this little vow that David is trying to get Jonathan to make, basically is one where you're going to treat me and you're going to take me over your father. And Jonathan's going to agree to it. Let's keep reading it. He says, for you've brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. Nevertheless, if there is iniquity in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father? So he begins by saying, okay, if your father doesn't like me, I need to know it, but, why don't you, I'd rather you kill me than him. And so Jonathan said, verse 9, far be it from you, for if I knew certainly that the evil was determined by my father to come upon you, then would I not tell you? Jonathan is almost hurt, if you will. How in the world is it that, if I knew this, I'd surely tell you. I'd let you know. David said to Jonathan, who will tell me, or what if your father answers you roughly? In other words, what if your father comes back and he's got a mean spirit to you? Jonathan said to David, come, let us go out into the field. So both of them went out into the field. Then Jonathan said to David, the Lord God of Israel is witness. When I have sounded out my father sometime tomorrow or the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so much and much more to Jonathan. But if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety, and the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. You see, he's making this covenant. He's coming back, Jonathan he's coming back to David with his side of the agreement. They're making this, if you will, sort of this pact, covenant, agreement. And so he says, here's what you need to know. And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. I want to make a point right here, verse 15. He says, you're not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. I don't know how best to determine this idea of forever right here. There are those that look at it and say this forever is just simply put for my lifetime. Now, as we continue in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you find out David is kind and is kind to Jonathan's household. But some have said that this forever is from time till time ends. And others have looked at it and said this forever just simply is the time of his lifetime. It seems as if that is the correct answer. That in other words, in my lifetime, while God is taking care of you, you take care of my family. And so this agreement is made. Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. This is long. Anything anybody like to say or add? Well, Jonathan, this is verse 17 now. Jonathan again caused David to vow because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. Then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon, and you will be missed because your seat will be empty. Now, there's an interesting thought, isn't it? somewhere years ago I read, I don't recall it all, so, but it was the idea of you'll be missed is the idea of is a sermon. It's the idea of church attendance. You'll be missed if your seat's empty. And there's truth to that. We look around, especially us, because we're smaller in number. We can look around and we all sit in the same place. And through the years, brethren have just gotten all upset about, we all sit in the same place every time we need to move around. And I tell those brethren if they want to do that, that's fine. But there are some that just like to sit in their usual places. And I said, and I've told them, and it is true, I said, it's helpful to me as a preacher. And it's probably helpful to the elders. Well, why is that? Because we can look around and see, by just the vacant pews, the empty pews, we can see who's there and who's not there. Now, larger church is a little bit more difficult, of course, to do that. But in a smaller church, it's handy. Now at different congregations, through the years, I've made people like on Sunday night, hey, everybody move it to the front, or everybody move to the back, spread out, and we try to get people together. And at Pomona, there were two sweet, sweet, sweet sisters and their daughter, and I don't care where we asked people to move, they didn't move. And I loved them dearly, still love the daughter, but the other two have passed. But they were so dear, but they were not going to move. That was their seat. I asked them once, I said, did you pay for it? And she said, well, yeah, kind of. But you're missed. And so Jonathan is telling David, you're going to be missed. Your seat will be empty. And when you've stayed 3 days, go down quickly and come to the place you hid on the day of the deed and remain by the stone Ezel. It seems as if it's familiar territory. It's familiar gathering places that David and Jonathan are meeting. And so they make this plan. Then I will shoot 3 arrows to the side. Go find the arrows. On this side of you, get them and come. Then as the Lord lives, there's safety for you and no harm. But if I say thus to the young man, look, the arrows are beyond you. Go your way, for the Lord has sent you away. And as for the matter which you and I have spoken of, indeed the Lord be between you and me forever. So, arrows are short. Hey, they're on this side of you. It means everything's all right. If I say they're beyond you, then take off. Go. The thing maybe to remember is the idea that it's believed that Jonathan practiced often, and so this was not an unusual thing for him to go out in the field and shoot. Whether he was shooting at a target or just shooting in the air, we don't know, but it makes sense that you would say he was shooting at some kind of target. That he had someone, because remember who he is. He's the king's son. He has someone, some sort of probably a young man that was probably classified as what we looked at last week, an armor bearer, that would go out with him and would be his retriever, I guess, trying not to demean the young man, but be his retriever of his arrows. But this was the agreement that was made with David and Jonathan. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down to eat the feast. This is verse 25 now. Now the king sat on his seat, as at other times, on a seat by the wall, and Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side. But excuse me. But David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not say anything that day, for he thought, something's happened to him. He is unclean. Surely he is unclean. And it happened the next day, the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. And Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to eat either yesterday or today? In the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, there was not just the idea of being pure, but there was the idea of being ceremonially pure. Go back to Leviticus 15, especially read really read the whole chapter to get the whole understanding of what's going on there. But only part of it deals with being ceremonially unclean. I think it's I know it is, verse 16 following is the discussion of being ceremonially unclean. We'll talk a little bit more about this a little later. But one had to be pure and one had to be ceremonially clean in order to be able to sacrifice, in order to be able to participate within the feast and with the events of the feast. And that was important. You remember, that was one of the things when we talk about the Good Samaritan and the priest and the Levite, and we often condemn them for not stopping to help the man. And yes, they should be. They should have stopped. But at the same time, too, if they were going to Jerusalem and they were going to worship, if they had touched the blood of that man, they would have been rendered ceremonially unclean and not able to perform their services in the worship of the people of that time. And so, should they have stopped? Yes. And should they have helped the man? Of course, by all means. But yet, at the same time, too, you see their dilemma. Well, the dilemma with David is, or at least Saul is giving him an out, David maybe is unclean. Maybe he's ceremonially unclean. But when the second day comes and David's not there, he wants to know, where's Jesse? Where's David? Where's Jesse's son? Where's David? Why isn't he here? So Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked permission of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, please let me go. It's kind of interesting because Jonathan changes a few words in what David's plan was, at least as it's recorded earlier on in this chapter. Jonathan changes a few things. You can catch on, but nevertheless, Jonathan says, he said, please let me go, for our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to be there. Some have speculated that Jesse may not have been alive at this time. Now, speculation. And they have said that if that be the case, Eliab, which was the oldest of the sons, remember back in the 15th chapter, that Eliab would be the eldest, and he would have been the one that would have called him back home. Well, it doesn't matter because that's not part of what the agreement with David was. Jonathan has made this up, or at least part of it. And his story is, look, his brother called him come back home to sacrifice with the family, to be with the family during the feast. And now if I have found favor in your eyes, Jonathan says, please let me get away and see my brothers. That's what Jonathan is telling of David. Therefore, he has not come to the king's table. In other words, Jonathan says, he came to me, he said he needed to go home. And I said, go ahead. Not a problem. Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan. And he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman. Now, this is an insult. And it's interesting that the father insults the son. But when he calls Jonathan's mother, notice what he says, basically a rebellious woman. The Hebrew word is interesting. It has the idea, not completely. Remember, I've told you, Hebrew is a lot sketchier than Greek, but the idea of a prostitute or a loose woman, a woman of loose morals. This is an insult, and really an insult to Jonathan's lineage. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. The point at which Saul knew seems to be sketchy. Samuel, as he writes this by inspiration, believe Samuel to be the author, of course, by inspiration, that Samuel, as he wrote this, would seem to imply that Saul knew something. Now, to what degree we don't know. We're not told. But Saul says, I know you've chosen him over me. And because you've done that, you'll never be established, nor your kingdom. Which turns out to be true, right? Because who's already been anointed? David's already been anointed. David is going to be the next king. And so, in many ways, this is a little prophetic. Therefore, send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. That's the decree of Saul, of David. And Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. Well, we've kind of hinted at and looked at, and we'll look at a little bit later in this book, Saul's mental state. You know, did he have mental illness of some kind? Did he have a brain tumor? What is it? We don't know for sure. You know, mental illness of some kind seems to be. But he also has a quick temper. He grows angry. He grows angry at his own son. Notice what he does. He casts a spear at him to kill him. It is believed that Saul's intent was to kill his own son. Why? Because he was angry. And that let Jonathan know, my dad's determined to kill David. So Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David, because his father had treated him shamefully. And so it was in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field at the time appointed with David, and a little lad was with him. Then he said to his lad, now run, find the arrows which I shoot. As the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him, and the lad had come to the place where the arrow was, which Jonathan had shot. Jonathan cried out after the lad and said, is not the arrow beyond you? So remember the covenant that they made. This told David he needed to get out of town. And Jonathan cried out after the lad, make haste, hurry, do not delay. So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master. But the lad did not know anything, only Jonathan and David knew of the matter. You see why I talked about baseball signals? That's what this is. This is baseball signals, if you will, kind of in a strange or different way. Jonathan gave his weapons to his lad and said to him, go carry them to the city. And as soon as the lad had gone, David arose from a place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed down 3 times. They kissed one another, and they wept together, but David more so. Then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, since we've both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever. So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So it was a time of parting. David cries more than Jonathan. Oh, you could speculate there, but think about it. David is really having to leave homeland. David is going to try to go here in a little bit, and he's going to go the next verse of chapter 21. He's going to try to go to Nob. Nob is a town that was in northern Philistia. It was Philistia, or the Philistines. Philistia was the country in which the Philistines came from. Philistia had 5 major cities, and Nob was one of those 5 major cities, but it was in the northern part of Philistia, which was right on the border of the southern border of Judah, which is where David is coming from. And David's going to try to see if he can land there, so to speak, in the next chapter. But is there anything anybody likes to say about the 20th chapter? It is sad. It is sad to say the least that a relationship and a friendship had to end over seemingly what was a great jealousy. But we see a man by the name of Saul who began his reign as a very humble individual. In many ways, when we looked at it, when we began, He really didn't want the job, but he took it. Wasn't sure what to do with it. He ran into criticism, as seemingly we all do. He ran into the criticism of some that said, well, he can't lead us. But yet at the same point in time, too, it was what the people wanted. They wanted a king. He grew successful. He grew as one that was listened to. He led military skirmishes, and he was able to win. He was able to gain power, and with power came his prestige, and he began to think a little bit more highly of himself than probably he should. And so, whatever drove him with regards to his anger, I still think, in whatever it was, it ultimately goes back to that antiphonal song that the ladies were singing when they came back, when David, excuse me, and Saul and all the men came back after David had killed Goliath. And the jealousy and the envy that came over him overtook him to the point that he wanted to take this young man's life. Even though it was his son's best friend, even though it was a young man that would have been considered a war hero and probably had his own prestige, even though David would have said, hey, I'm just an old, as we would say it today, I'm just an old country boy. I'm just an old shepherd. And yet Saul is driven to the point of, I want to kill him. And there's no backing down. The vindictiveness of a man. I've seen it. I've experienced it from an individual. You've probably seen it too. And it's a sad tale. David really didn't do anything to Saul. He really, if you stop and think about it, he helped Saul because nobody wanted to go out and fight Goliath. David was willing. And so we get to the 20th chapter and we find out that David and Jonathan have this strong bond. And this bond is so great that Jonathan sides with David over his own father. That just, I had a wonderful father and a mother, but I had a wonderful father. And I just can't see that. My dad was my best man at my wedding because he was my best man in my life. And so, you know, I I had good friends. I had good friends in high school, good friends in college. Suzanne got married right after I got out of school. And I just find that hard to understand. But it tells you of the bond and the relationship the two had. And maybe that's a part of Saul's reactions. Maybe, don't know. Maybe it is. But then, of course, as we said, the signals of how to get away. And David now is going to have to flee his homeland, flee what he knows and what he loves. And the question arises, as we said, he's going to go to Nob. But when we look at that and think about that, he's not successful in landing there. But imagine being forced out of home. Now, maybe you chose to move away from home. Maybe it was a job, maybe it was who you married, whatever. But you chose. But imagine being pushed out of home. David was pushed. Anything else? Mm-hmm. Could very well have been. It's a good point. It's a good point.
Being his father's son, Samuel had said the Lord's taken the kingdom from him.
Mm-hmm.
And if his deteriorating mental state, those in his inner circle would see maybe,
Yeah.
because Saul obviously wanted him around.
Yeah.
Because it's always keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So even though David, he's already being his comfort zone with his lyre playing to calm him down.
Yeah. 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 I I've always looked at Saul's issues as a mental illness. I may be wrong. It's an issue. There is an issue. I think we could agree to that. I think it's probably a mental issue. He could have been manic depressive as far as that goes. I mean, that fits. That fits. And I know there have been doctoral theses written on that. I've not read any. I've read excerpts from some, but yeah, it could be. Anything else? All good. Well, let's go on. I think we can cover a little ground in the 21st chapter. David came to Nob to Ahimelech, the priest. And the reason he came to Ahimelech in Nob was the Philistines in Jeremiah 7. If you go back and read Jeremiah 7, the Philistines destroyed Shiloh. That was the place where all the priests were. And David comes to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David. And he said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" This I find interesting. And I can't explain why Ahimelech is afraid. Is he afraid of David? And he evidently knew what David had done with regards to killing the giant Goliath. And we'll get into that next week. But also, if it wasn't that, which I'm not sure that it was it the fact that he thought David should have more with him, and so David was coming to do something to him? There's no way to know, but Ahimelech is afraid. And he says, "Why are you alone and no one's with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, here's his second lie, folks. "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now, therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever you can find.'" David has gone, and probably well, the old King James called it victuals, his food, his grub, his supplies. It's gone. And so David lies to Ahimelech, and he says, "Hey, the king sent me." It's all right. King sent me. But he sent me kind of as a secret. I got some men, and they're stashed on down the road, and I need you to give me five loaves of bread. Or it's kind of interesting because notice what it says, "whatever you can find." The priest answered David and said, "There is no common bread on hand, but there's holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women." There's no common bread. In other words, there's no just everyday bread. They made bread pretty much every day. There's no just everyday bread. But there is holy bread. Now remember, they would go and on the table of showbread, you had 6 and 6 loaves on each side. You had 12. They're stacked up, and you replace those loaves every week in the the temple, the tabernacle. And so every Sabbath, the priest would go in and change the bread. This was considered holy bread. And so he tells them, he says, now we got some holy bread. We don't have any everyday bread, common bread, but we've got holy bread. But he asks, he says, are the young men you're going to give it to, have they at least kept themselves from women? In other words, we get back to the idea of, are they ceremonially clean? They haven't had sex with any woman in the last 3 days or so, have they? It's kind of interesting because they changed everything around as far as, only the priests were supposed to touch this bread, and they were only to have access to it, not the common man. And so they changed, they are trying to change the call that God has made. But David answered the priest and said to him, truly, women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is, in effect, common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. Not exactly according to what the law said, right? Now, according to Exodus 19, they were to keep themselves pure from sexual relations, but at the same time, too, David is saying, all right, when you took the bread off of the table of showbread, it became common. That which was holy and committed to the Lord now all of a sudden is holy as far as David is concerned. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David, if there not here on hand a spear or a sword, for I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. Lie number 3. He's racking them up. He says, hey, I don't have any protection. The reason I don't have any protection is because the king sent me, but he sent me in a hurry, and I forgot to pick it up. Well, look what's said. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistines, whom you killed, is in the valley of Elah. See, he knew who David was. And he knew what he had done. That's why that may somewhat figure into the factor of the fear. But he says, the sword is here. Theologians, scholars believe that David knew that, because it was commonplace, and it was commonplace for you to if you won a victory, to get a trophy, so to speak. Now, it could have been Goliath's head, but in this case it was his sword, because he also took that. But to take something of means from the enemy that you won the battle over, you would take that trophy and you would put it in a prominent place for everyone to come see and say, oh, we've gained this great victory. And so David knew that it was there. The priest knew that it was there. And he says, yeah, it's there. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod, which we've talked about before. If you'll take that, take it, for there is no other except the one here. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. And so David takes it. Any questions, comments, suggestions, thoughts? Well, that's a good place to end. Now, as you pick up the 10th verse here in the 21st chapter, don't try to fit it from a chronology standpoint. Try to just get the story. Samuel is not a great chronologist. He's a great storyteller, but he's not a great chronologist as we studied this book. But it's a fascinating little thought here in verses 10 through the end of the chapter. Anything else? Well, let's bow right quick for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, for the opportunity that we've had to come to study your word, realizing that your word is important to us, and realizing that this history is important as we see your love, your protection, your care for people that even at times didn't act and do what they should have in the way they should have. But nevertheless, because of your grace and your mercy, you were kind and loving to them. And so we realize that kindness and love comes to us as well. We ask that you be with those that were announced earlier that are sick or ill or going through difficult times. And we ask that you be with those individuals and bless them as their needs and according to their benefit. We ask that you watch over us, that you bless us, that you hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great, great week. Rest of the week. See you Sunday.